The founder of Democracy Works Foundation, Professor Prof Gumede, says opposition parties must forget about press statements or social media posts and get their hands dirty if they want to disrupt the ANC in next year's election. Forget about parliament, provincial legislatures and municipal councillors, he says, and pursue movement-style politics. Professor Gumede joins us now to take a look at this and more. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. What has been your observation of why the ANC has managed to retain power for so long in spite of the many failures that you have pointed out in your opinion piece?
Good morning. I'm very happy to be speaking to you this morning. I think the important thing about the ANC, why the ANC has been in power for such a long time, despite, the state failures, high levels of corruption and inefficiencies. The first thing is, the ANC is not a traditional political party. The ANC is a liberation movement, a movement party. And a movement party really is a party that has branches in almost every township, every village. And secondly, it has many volunteer members in every part of the country. And those volunteer members almost operate like a church at the local level. If a community member or a supporter or a voter of the ANC is in trouble somewhere, there'll be ANC members will support, will provide solidarity. Or if somebody struggles, for example, just with home affairs, there will be a local organization that help the person. And that is what one calls movement parties. The party is present everywhere, at funerals, at cultural events, at birthday parties, at weddings. And that is the reason why the party has been such a powerful grassroots force.
Mm-hmm. How much of that can we put down to the church of the ANC, and how much of it can we put down to the psyche of South Africa? A lot of distrust still remains among races in this country.
Absolutely. There is a component, obviously, of the past where, sadly, many people still vote based on the past. They vote for the ANC based on its past record, like a church. They see the ANC like a church or like a sports club, like the Chiefs. Chiefs may be failing, but a lot of people supporters continue to support it. So sadly, many people look at the ANC and other political parties also as if it's, their favorite sports club that needs to be supported through thick and thin. Now, politics is not like that. Democracy is not like that. Democracy is not like a church or like, a football club. Where you support your party through thick and thin. No, in a democracy, what makes it work is actually the fact that one votes for another party, even if one doesn't like their party. That's a critical part of democracy. So if citizens in society do not realize that, it's a continuous, then what will happen? You repeat failure, recycle political governing parties based on the past, and that brings a failure. So that really is part of it. But the other part of it is that our opposition parties in this system, our current opposition parties in South Africa almost function like in Western democracies, like Westminster system. In a Westminster system, political parties are not movement parties. What they do, they issue press statements, they debate in Parliament. The president comes, or ministers come to Parliament, they respond to the ministers, they ask questions, and so on. And that's where they are. So that's the Westminster style, more in Western democracies. In our kind of country, with its liberation history, we need movement opposition also. So what we need is opposition to be much more grassroots based in the communities, also have the equivalent of branches, also provide solidarity and for the supporters, but also for ordinary citizens, and do things like fixing potholes, providing services, even if they are not in government.
You argue that the EFF is one such party.
Absolutely. I think, the success of the EFF so far has really been is that actually it has become a movement opposition party. It's got volunteers, it's got branches. And I mean, increasingly what we see, EFF members are actually cleaning the streets, they're fixing potholes, even if they are not in government, in a municipality. They're providing food for somebody, for, families or communities are in crisis. So they do these things, and if somebody is a victim of crime in the community, they dare, on the court steps, they dare with the families. Now that is what a movement party does. So, whereas, traditionally, some of the other political parties, let's say the UDM or even the DA, what they do is, they will issue a press statement or they will ask a question in Parliament, if there is a crisis at a local level. Instead of combining Parliament and the legislatures and with also being actually at the crisis point, showing solidarity for someone, for a citizen that's a victim of crime or a victim of child kidnapping, or there's a storm, their house collapsed. They're not there rebuilding it. They still, opposition parties still wait for government or they criticize government, but they're not there at the spot helping.
On the ANC, there's a school of thought that believes, well, in hindsight or in retrospect, the ANC was not ready to govern. You had people that gave up arms and had to, quickly negotiate the settlement and move into this democracy. And then you have another school of thought that says, well, we've had a little bit more time to learn how to govern. And so why is it that it is not bearing fruit? Your observation?
Yes, no, the ANC's liberation movement did not have the capacity and the leadership to govern. That really is an important observation. Because, if you're a liberation movement or independence movement, you oppose and you're outside the country. So, the bulk of the ANC was outside the country, and so when they came to power, when they took over the state, South Africa has a very sophisticated state. I mean, we've got a very sophisticated business sector, markets and institutions. We've got a very diverse society, but the ANC didn't have the capacity. Even up to now, the reason why the ANC is struggling in government is still, after 30 years, doesn't have the deep capacity and the competence to govern. For example, just typically, if a government is in charge, when one introduces a policy, if the government has, or the governing party has the sophistication and the capacity, they will look at the policy, then they will look at the risk of the policy to the economy, to everyone. But then they will also study the past policy, because sometimes you don't need a new policy, you just need to trigger the past policy. So there isn't, if you look at all of the policies, even in more recent policies, say the NHI, that's major big policy. You can see there is no capacity, there's no competence to understand that policies will have to be implemented on the basis, or even introduced, whether on the basis if there is resources to do that, if there is a capacity to do that, what will be the alternative policies? Would the alternative policies be better? What will be the risk? Will the health will it collapse the health system? Will health specialists flee the country, going somewhere else? All of those things, and that is what I mean by capacity. So currently the ANC doesn't have capacity. It still, as a governing party, doesn't have that capacity.
Prof, then you speak to policymakers and you speak to researchers. They'll tell you that the ANC also inherited empty coffers. You had some public institutions which then quickly turned into private institutions at the dawn of democracy, and they're still reaping the benefits to date as private entities doing business with government when they once were the government. And so you also speak to policymakers and you speak to researchers, and they'll tell you that it is so difficult to get this idea of change in South Africa, to put it simply, because you've got so much resistance to that change where you see it benefiting everybody. Yes, there may be a problem with resources, and yes, there may be a problem with capacity. What has been the resistance to change in South Africa, where you are seeing the majority of the people of this country enjoying this democracy?
In all societies in transition, there are resistance, so it's not unique to us. I actually right, I hear people who say that. Yes, there were resistance from the old guard, but once the government takes over the state, as the ANC did, the government has a budget every year, of trillions of money. The government has the power, to enact laws and so on. So that shouldn't be excused. In fact, because many people have given that excuse, it is given the government, a way out, and because if we go that way, we don't hold the government accountable. There are other societies, like places like Singapore, South Korea, and so on, or Japan, where there have been absolute or similar higher levels of resistance for governments when they come in. Now, when one has resistance or opposition, I think the first thing is always for a government, if it fails on being honest, because governing demands trust in a government, to bring opposition along, and that's the act of governing. So the act of competent governing is to bring along those who oppose you. And the first thing that one needs to bring people is trust. So even if people disagree with you, is the trust. And trust is based on honesty. So, so what happened was, at the beginning of, after 1994, the ANC quickly lost the trust because of corruption, because corruption breaks down the trust immediately. So it then hardened the opposition of people that were already there. So that's the first absolutely critical part. The second thing, in terms of competent people, I cannot repeat, why competence is so important. I mean, we talk in South Africa very glibly about the developmental state and so on, but at the heart of developmental states are competent, not money, not the state, but people, and that has been missing. I mean, right, we just look at our society now, government will appoint people based on a struggle credentials to run sophisticated entities, engineering companies, and so on. So, a society with a lack of resources cannot afford to have people that don't have the technical competency in the job. That is why the Chinese has done so well, and why the Chinese have the saying, it doesn't matter the color of the cat as long as the cat can catch the mice. Now, it may sound a bit like a joke, but it's absolutely serious. And that is also, I think, the mistake of the ANC when they came to power. Initially, they only put their sort of trusted loyalists into key positions in government, but also in civil society, in non-government institutions, in sports institutions, in cultural institutions. So, for example, somebody would be appointed to run a Nassau Rugby Union that never played rugby in their life, but because they have struggled with themselves. So what happens then is not only the state, parts of the state collapse, but parts of every part of society collapse because of their kind of deployment. Whereas if the ANC would have started off by only appointing the most competent people at every level of government, of institutions, sports, cultural institutions, community institutions, it would have been a different situation.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your time this morning. Professor William Gumede, founder of Democracy Works Foundation and Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance.